If you're drawn to stories of untamed lands, wounded hearts, and unexpected love rising from the dust of West Texas, then this tale of Xavier Kincaid and Dahlia Blackett will pull you in from the very first moment. Their journey from pain to healing, from silence to trust, is a reminder that sometimes the harshest landscapes give birth to the strongest bonds. Before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like and share this video, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button for Western Horizons to stay connected with more gripping Wild West love stories just like this one. Stay with us, the frontier has many more tales to tell. In the quiet stretch of West Texas, where the horizon seemed to melt into the earth and dusty winds carried the weight of old stories, Xavier Kincaid moved through life with a past he rarely spoke of. Most folks in the nearby town only knew him as the quiet cowboy who kept to himself, the kind who tipped his hat politely but never lingered long enough for conversation. He lived out on an aging ranch a few miles past the main road, spending his days fixing fences, tending cattle, and riding out into the open land where silence felt more like company than loneliness. It wasn't that he disliked people, he simply found comfort in distance, in the predictable rhythm of work that kept memories from surfacing too often. One late afternoon, when the sun hung low and cast a warm, amber glow across the dirt roads, Xavier rode into town for supplies. His horse, a steady, dark-coated mare named Juniper, had carried him through more storms than he cared to remember, and she deserved a long, cool drink before the ride home. He tied her reins loosely to the post outside the old feed store, its wooden sign creaking softly in the breeze. As he pumped water into the trough, a familiar quiet settled around him, broken only by Juniper's gentle snorts and the distant clatter of wagons rolling down the road. It was just another ordinary day in West Texas, until he noticed her. Dahlia Blackett stepped out of a dusty truck parked a few yards away, brushing wind-blown strands of hair from her face as she studied the feed store with a mixture of hesitation and determination. She wasn't the kind of woman who blended into the landscape. There was something striking about her, not because she was dressed to impress. Her jeans were worn, her boots scuffed, and her shirt carried the faint wrinkles of long travel, but because she moved with a quiet resolve, as though she had picked up the weight of her entire past and decided she wouldn't let it break her anymore. Xavier didn't intend to stare, yet he found himself watching her longer than he should have. There was something in her eyes, a blend of strength and sorrow, that made him wonder what brought her to this dusty corner of the world. She caught his gaze for a moment, and he looked away quickly, busying himself with adjusting Juniper's reins even though nothing really needed adjusting. But Dahlia didn't seem bothered. Instead, she offered him a small, polite nod, one of those simple gestures that held more warmth than words, and headed toward the store. He followed a few minutes later, pushing open the creaking door and stepping into the dim interior filled with the familiar smell of grain and leather. Dahlia was already at the counter, speaking with the elderly store owner, Mr. Talbot, who was explaining the different feed varieties with the kind of slow patience only men of his age possessed. Xavier didn't intend to listen, but the shop was small, and their voices carried easily. From the pieces he overheard, he gathered that Dahlia was new to town, that she had rented a small cabin on the outskirts, and that she didn't know much about livestock but was willing to learn. Mr. Talbot glanced over Xavier's shoulder, spotted him, and his eyes lit up as if he had been handed the perfect solution. Without hesitation, the old man called out, "Xavier knows more about horses and feed than the rest of us combined. If you've got questions, young lady, he's the one to ask." Xavier stiffened, silently cursing the old man's timing, while Dahlia turned toward him with a soft smile that somehow felt disarming. She approached slowly, not shyly, but with the kind of cautious confidence of someone used to managing on her own. "I'm still figuring things out," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "Mr. Talbot says you might be able to point me in the right direction." He shifted his hat slightly, clearing his throat before answering. "I can try." The words came out quieter than he intended, but she didn't seem to mind. For a few minutes they discussed the basics, what kind of feed was best for a beginner, which tools she might need, how to manage simple ranch tasks without getting overwhelmed. Xavier kept his explanations short, not wanting to overwhelm her, yet Dahlia listened intently, nodding at every detail as though each piece of advice mattered. There was something unusually grounding about the way she listened, as if she wasn't just hearing his words but observing the unspoken things between them. When they finished, she thanked him sincerely, offering a smile that reached her eyes, lighting them up just enough to make him feel something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long while. Xavier stepped back, unsure what to say next, but Dahlia didn't push for conversation. Instead, she gave him one last nod and walked toward the door, the late-day sunlight catching her hair as she stepped outside. Xavier followed soon after, carrying a small sack of feed over his shoulder. Dahlia stood by her truck, double-checking her supplies before closing the door. For a moment, their eyes met again, and this time neither of them looked away quickly. There was an unspoken softness in the air, an understanding that didn't need words. It wasn't a spark of romance, not yet, more like the quiet recognition of two people who had both lived through storms and come out the other side with just enough hope left to try again. Just as Dahlia climbed into her truck, she paused and looked back at him. "Thank you," she said once more, her voice carrying something deeper this time, gratitude, maybe, or a hint of relief. Xavier nodded, tipping his hat slightly. "Anytime." As she drove off down the dusty road, Xavier stood there longer than necessary, watching the truck grow smaller until it disappeared around the bend. He didn't fully understand why that brief encounter had affected him so strongly. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, steady but tired, hopeful but cautious. Maybe it was the familiarity of the pain she kept behind her composed expression, something he recognized because he carried the same weight inside himself. When he finally mounted Juniper and began the long ride back to his ranch, the sky had begun to shift into shades of violet and gold. The land stretched endlessly before him, steady and silent, but for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel as heavy. He still didn't know who Dahlia Blackett really was or what had brought her to West Texas, but he knew, instinctively and without explanation, that their paths hadn't crossed by accident. There was something about her presence that lingered in his thoughts, something that made him feel like the story of his life, once marked by loss, regret, and miles of solitude, might be shifting, even if just a little. And as the wind brushed against him and the sun dipped behind the hills, Xavier felt an unfamiliar warmth settle in his chest, a quiet acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, something new had begun that afternoon outside the old feed store, something neither of them had expected but both might eventually need. As days passed, their paths crossed more often, sometimes by chance and sometimes by choice, though neither of them admitted the difference out loud. Xavier would find himself riding closer to the edge of town, telling himself he needed supplies even when his pantry was full. Dahlia, meanwhile, would linger a little longer at the general store, pretending to browse tools she didn't need just in case he walked in. There was no rush, no bold declarations, only small and steady moments that drew them nearer without either pushing too hard. Xavier continued to guard the scars of his past, the ones carved so deep into him that even time hadn't softened them. He didn't talk much about what he had lost or the kind of man he had been before everything shifted. Dahlia sensed it, his hesitations, his quietness, the way his eyes sometimes drifted far away even when he stood right in front of her. But she didn't press. She knew what it meant to protect the fragile pieces of a painful memory, and Xavier admired her for that silent understanding alone. Dahlia herself carried a different kind of weight. She had left behind a life filled with noise, criticism, and battles she could no longer fight. West Texas had offered her something she hadn't felt in a long time, the possibility of breathing without fear. She worked odd jobs, picked up small ranch tasks, and learned to mend fences or stack hay with a determination that impressed even the old ranchers nearby. She was starting over from nothing, but she didn't complain. Xavier watched her slowly rebuild herself, and something about her resilience stirred a tenderness he had buried long ago. Evenings became the quiet space where they both unintentionally found refuge. The first time it happened, Dahlia had stopped by Xavier's ranch to return a tool he had lent her. The sun was sinking, the fire pit was glowing softly, and he had invited her to sit for a minute before making the long drive back. That minute became an hour. And then another. They talked, but not about everything, just a little, just enough. After that, it became a habit neither of them questioned. She would arrive occasionally with homemade coffee or fresh biscuits she was still learning to bake. He would offer her a seat by the fire, a blanket if the nights turned cold, and the comfort of stillness that only open land could provide. They shared pieces of their stories, never forcing the puzzle to complete itself. Dahlia told him about the city she'd left behind, the life that had suffocated her. Xavier shared bits of the people he had lost, the guilt he still carried, and the land that had saved him when he had nowhere else to go. They never tried to fix each other. They simply listened, and that listening became the bridge they didn't realize they were building. Some nights they talked until the fire dwindled into glowing embers. Other nights, they sat without speaking at all, watching the stars spread across the vast Texas sky. The silence between them was never empty, it was warm, grounding, and slowly healing. It made them feel less alone. Trust grew in small gestures, Xavier teaching Dahlia how to properly saddle a horse, Dahlia reminding him it was all right to take a day off from work and just rest, Xavier showing up at her cabin when her water pump broke, Dahlia bringing him a hot meal when she sensed he hadn't eaten properly after a long day. Each act carved out a space for the other in their lives, even when neither admitted the significance aloud. One evening, a storm rolled across the land, sudden and fierce, pressing heavy clouds low across the sky. Dahlia had been heading home from town when the rain began pouring so violently she could barely see the road. Without thinking, she turned toward Xavier's ranch, her heart pounding with both fear and a strange kind of certainty. He saw her truck headlights cutting through the rain and rushed outside, coat half-buttoned, hair soaked instantly. He helped her inside without a word, but the look he gave her, concerned, relieved, settled something inside her that had been trembling for years. They spent the night listening to the storm batter the windows, talking softly by the fire while thunder rolled through the hills. For the first time, Xavier told her the whole truth of his past, the mistake that had fractured his life, the person he had lost, the years he spent believing he didn't deserve another chance. Dahlia didn't cry, though the story was heavy. She simply reached for his hand and held it, not to comfort him but to stand with him in the pain. It was the first time Xavier allowed someone to touch the part of him he had kept hidden. In return, Dahlia shared the final pieces of her own story, the relationship she had left, the years of constant belittling that had worn her down, the way she had lost herself until she barely recognized who she was. She told him how she had driven for miles without a destination until West Texas stretched out before her like a promise she hoped she could trust. Xavier didn't pity her. He simply listened, steady and present, and the softness in his eyes told her she wasn't weak for surviving. She was strong for choosing to walk away. By the time the storm passed, something had shifted between them, not in a dramatic confession or a sudden romantic moment, but in a deeper way. They had seen each other clearly, without defenses, and the connection that had once been subtle now felt undeniable. The days that followed carried a different rhythm. They were still careful, still gentle, but there was a quiet certainty in the way they moved around each other. Dahlia laughed more easily. Xavier spoke a little more freely. They walked along the fields together, tended to chores side by side, and shared meals without needing a reason. It wasn't a rushed romance, it was the slow building of trust, affection, and the possibility of a life neither had dared hope for. One late afternoon, they rode together across Xavier's land. Juniper carried Xavier, while a calmer mare he had trained trotted beneath Dahlia. They rode without talking, the only sound the soft rhythm of hooves and a warm breeze sweeping across the plains. Dahlia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sense of freedom settle into her bones, something she hadn't felt in years. When she looked over at Xavier, he was already watching her, his expression open in a way she had never seen before. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. Something in his gaze said everything, that he cared for her deeply, that he felt alive again in her presence, that he was willing to risk his heart if she was willing to stay. Dahlia felt the emotion rise in her chest, a soft but fierce certainty of her own. Their future didn't need grand promises or perfect answers. They had walked through shadows, carried old wounds, and found their way, slowly, gently, to a place where they no longer had to face the world alone. They didn't rush into love, but love came anyway, settling into the small spaces of their lives until it filled them completely. As they rode back toward the ranch, the sun dipped low behind them, casting long, warm light across the land. Xavier reached out his hand, and Dahlia took it without hesitation. Their fingers intertwined smoothly, naturally, like they had always been meant to find each other. In that quiet moment, with the land stretching endlessly around them and the weight of their pasts finally loosening, they both understood the truth they had been moving toward since the day they first met. Whatever storms lay behind them or ahead, their future just might be written side by side, and this time, neither of them planned to walk away.